Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Demystifying Deaccessioning, one of the many webinars produced by the Association of Art Museum Curators, the AAMC. My name is Dr. Deneen Dickenthal, and I'm your moderator today. And I'm also a member of the AAMC's Professional Development Committee, which helped plan and develop this webinar. Thank you to the team at the AAMC, especially Judith and Monica, for their help in coordinating the webinar. I would like to introduce our panelists. From Sotheby's, Vice Chairman Americas, Head of Museum Private and Corporate Art Services, Nina Del Rio. From the American Alliance of Museums, and Senior Director for Museum Standards and Excellence, Julie Hart. From the Denver Art Museum, Curator of Native Arts, John Lukovic. And from the Portland Museum of Art, Director of Registration and Collections, Lauren Silverson. During the process of developing the webinar, we realized that this topic would benefit from more than one discussion or more than one webinar. So we would like you to consider this the beginning of a conversation about deaccessioning, one in which we discuss the basics or the logistics of the process in the context of the United States. There will be a webinar in the future to discuss the international context and also issues and difficulties that may arise during the process. We encourage you to ask questions, which can be done on the panel to the side of the screen. And I might ask a few questions after each panelist speaks, but we'll have a question and answer period at the end of all of the discussions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available at the AAMC's website, www.artcurators.org. The bios of our panelists can also be found there. And now our distinguished panelists will talk about the different aspects of deaccessioning and their roles in the process at their specific institutions. We'll begin with Julie Hart, who will discuss, in part, best practices when it comes to deaccessioning. Julie?
Thank you. So I am going to cover some of the key ethical principles around deaccessioning and talk about some of the core standards and common practices that kind of flow from that. And I think it's important to just kind of set the stage by saying excellence across the museum field begins with ethics and standards that the field sets for itself in a self-regulatory manner to promote accountability. That's to not only each other in the field, but to your stakeholders, and to provide a basis for good decision-making, consistent decision-making, and to really prove a museum's worthiness of public trust, and not just individual museums' worthiness of public trust, but the field at large. It's really critical for the museum field's credibility overall. So there's sort of about 3 ethical principles I want to focus on that will kind of inform the rest of this discussion. And that is one, and I don't really need to probably tell you this, but museums are educational organizations that are grounded in the tradition of public service. And as such, you're holding your collections for the public benefit. And your mission is determining the scope and focus of these activities, including what you collect. And, describing the distinctive nature of your collection and guiding your decision-making when it comes to operations, collecting, governance, all that kind of stuff. So really, I think first underlying ethical principle is museums are grounded in the tradition of the public trust and public service and education. And so collectively, museums share responsibility for collection stewardship that and I quote from our Code of Ethics, the AM Code of Ethics for Museums, that entails the highest public trust and carries with it the presumption of rightful ownership, permanence, care, documentation, accessibility, and responsible disposal. So again, I don't need to tell all of you that museums are acquiring items of cultural or scientific value for your collection through donation, through purchase, rescue, through field research, etc., all kinds of different manners of acquisition. And you're holding these for the benefit of present and future generations. And while these have a monetary value, or may have a monetary value when you acquire them, once they become part of your collection, that really kind of ceases to exist. That becomes secondary to their importance as a means to understand and enhance our understanding of the world around you and fulfill your mission, your institution's mission. So consequently, museum collections are considered cultural, not financial assets, and they're held for the public benefit. So I think that's a really key thing that probably comes up over and over and over again when it comes to deaccessioning, is that it is items are cultural assets, not financial assets. And that's where many museums find themselves getting into hot water if they're thinking of them as financial assets. So, you know, a lot of times museums do experience financial difficulties, et cetera, and you have to make some hard decisions when it comes to those type of situations. But again, first and foremost, they got to put the collections first as non-financial assets. And the decision to deaccession, and I would want to reinforce the fact that deaccessioning is a normal and appropriate tool for good collections management. It is, which is something that often the general public doesn't understand, that concept. So the decision to deaccession an object should really be guided by your museum's collections management plan, its code of ethics, and obviously approved by the governing authority. And it should be based on doing it against a set of set criteria. And I think you'll hear from this from the other panelists. You know, you've got to have policies and procedures in place with a predetermined set of characteristics and criteria for what gets deaccessioned and a process to follow. So that's really key. And that needs to be done in accordance with standards that's relevant to your museum's discipline. In your case, art museums, and because there is such a great variety of in the museum field, everything from art museums to zoos, that collections mean something different, slightly different in the way they're cared for and approached and documented, and even the term of deaccessioning and what happens to them and the disposal aspect of it after you deaccession. And I want to reinforce that those are two separate steps. So I think we'll probably get into that when we talk a little bit more about the process. That there are different practices, but they're all kind of rolling back up to some of the same core institutional ethical principles. And again, in whatever method that you're going to use to dispose of them, the decision to deaccession something should be separate from the determination of the means of its disposal. So again, you're kind of separating those two different things. You're deaccessioning it for a reason, and then you're making a decision about how you want to dispose of it, rather than the other way around. The disposal method driving, and the rationale for the disposal method driving the what you're going to deaccession. And I think the sort of really hard and fast ethical principle out there is that in no event, if you're going to sell your objects that you deaccession, that the money has to be sort of reinvested in the institution, in the collection, for either new acquisitions or for their direct care, not for operating purposes, fiscal distress or something like that. And for the art museum community, there is, I know that the AAMD says that the ethical principle is only use it for new acquisitions, but just to know in general for the field and the diversity of the field, you can use it for direct care. And we have a whole white paper on direct care that AM does, because that is a sort of a gray term that's not defined. So it is important to have that terminology in your own codes, your policies, procedures, have the term direct care clearly defined if you are going to use that as one of the acceptable reasons. But those are the only two reasons you could deaccession something. And so, you know, those are the core ethical principles. And there are some documents and some practices that go along with it. The AAM puts out a set of core standards, kind of umbrella standards for the field, and those are available on AAM's website. And I think we've got some links that are going to go up in the chat box. Those kind of unpack sort of the big issues that are in the code of ethics, and there's kind of 7 categories, whether it's public trust, risk management, collection stewardship, et cetera, that kind of break all that down and to go a lot more detail. And then from there, there's also something called core documents. Those are 5 fundamental documents that all museums should have, and 2 of them relate to deaccessioning. That's your code of ethics for your institution and your collections management policy. And both of those need to have parallel or exact language that parallel each other, that talk about how you are going to use the proceeds from any sale of your objects you deaccession, as well as your ethical, kind of reinforcing those ethical principles of the museum field for your institution about its deaccessioning practices. So that's kind of the real highlights, and kind of hopefully some context that will help inform the process and the details that you're going to hear about from our other panelists.
Thank you, Julie. I would encourage people to ask questions. I haven't gotten any yet, but I would encourage you to ask questions, but we can, like I said, we can leave the question and answer period towards the end while you formulate some questions in mind. So we're going to turn to John Lukovic at Denver Art Museum, Curator of Native Arts, who will pay special attention to the role of the curator in the deaccessioning process, with some attention paid to NAGPRA. John?
Thank you very much, Janine, and welcome everyone. Just to put a little bit of context to this, the Denver Art Museum is 125 years old. My department, the Native Arts Department, was founded in 1925. So we've been collecting for a long time, and we have a large collection. Now, my department has both American Indian art, which is the bulk of my collection, as well as African and Oceanic art. And my department as a whole has about 20,000 works of art just in this part of the collection, which accounts for about 25% of the entire institution's collection. That's a lot of work to manage and to deal with. But also the time element becomes a factor, and I'll get to that in just a second here. In preparation for an ongoing renovation project that we have right now, all the curators were tasked with assessing our collection to identify what works are most appropriate for our collection, and if there are works that are maybe no longer appropriate. And I'll get into some other criteria as well. And we were asked with doing these collection reviews, but also a refinement. Now, collection refinement is kind of the organizing or the guiding principle in what we were doing. I mean, we weren't even calling it deaccessioning because we were focusing more on the process rather than the actual act itself, which is in many ways kind of it's a process of changing a legal status within an institution, from an actual collection object to a non-collection object. So how and why do we deaccession works from a collection? Well, let's first start with the why. And now I will say that I am speaking specifically from a position of an art museum curator, and the examples I'm giving are specifically from the Denver Art Museum. So your own institutions, based on your ethics policies or your collections management policies, will vary as well. But as curators, at least here at DAM, we're charged to refine and improve the permanent collection as a standard component of growth and development of our institutions. Now here at DAM, we are asked to do periodic reviews of our collections, find strengths, find weaknesses, find opportunities, and of course, find areas to refine our collection. Now, some of these processes you'll notice that there is some judgments that are required. There is some subjectivity, but it's truly based on the experiences of we as curators. So in order to do this, first we have to examine our existing collections and identify any works of art that their aesthetic merit or significance to the collection fall outside of that specific collection in which it lies, or falls outside of the collecting goals of the institution, which does change over time, or is redundant to other material in the collection. The reality is, things that may be collected in the 1930s may have been the best examples that we had at that time. But over the years since then, we may have collected past it where we've acquired additional examples of that work that may be far superior to what was originally brought in the collection. So In those instances, we may wind up with works in our collection that are of lesser use for the institution, and that is something to keep in mind. We also must consider if an artwork does not enhance the museum's holdings or compromises the institution's ability to properly care for or conserve the core collections. Case in point, if you have a work in your collection that is made of shaving cream and chocolate, that the ongoing care of that is in some ways cost prohibitive for everything else you intend to do, perhaps that's a decision that you need to make. Although in hindsight, maybe you should have made that decision before you even acquired the piece in the first place, but that's not for me to judge. Also, the museum has the obligation in those particular instances to remove the objects from collections and to dispose of them with the most appropriate means possible. And we'll get to that in just a moment. It's also important to note that an artwork should be considered for deaccessioning only if the conditions, or if the overall collections are improved by their removal, not just, and the collections truly are the key focus of this. So here at DAM, we also note that deaccessioning shall not be contemplated in response to current art vogues or based on individuals' tastes. You know, there may be things that a previous curator acquired that you just don't like, and that's not good enough to for the reason why you get rid of it. There needs to be substantial other reasons why. So what criteria should we as curators use? To be considered for deaccessioning, an artwork, at least for here at the Denver Art Museum, must be determined to fill at least one of these following criteria: not appropriate to an art museum, not in a physical condition to be exhibited, unsuitable as a study piece, a known fake or forgery, a duplication or a duplication of or is inferior to an artwork already in the collection, a secondary or lesser quality artwork that does not represent a specific area well, artworks eligible under NAGPRA criteria, as well as artworks eligible under Nazi-era provenance or repatriation criteria. Now, decision makers who are in this process should also consider the quality relative to the museum's present holdings, the stature of the collection in which the artwork belongs, such as, like, you know, is it more important to keep that piece in your collection to maintain the integrity of the collection as a whole, or is it kind of a one-off piece that, you know, is outside of that scope? Is it a one of a kind or a unique, or has some kind of unique nature to it? And inferiority, or is it inferiority to a proposed acquisition in the area presently under consideration? Those are all things that we keep in mind when we're evaluating if something is appropriate or not to remain in the collection. But there's also a level of responsibility that comes with this. I mean, it solely rests on this responsibility. So all artworks from the permanent collection, in order to be deaccessioned, must be researched in advance to confirm legal title, donor, and if there's any donor restrictions that exist, and if there's any sensitivity issues. I really can't stress this enough. Careful consideration is truly needed, and you do need to have a level of knowledge associated with this. And if you don't, I highly recommend that you consult with specialists in the field of the particular area that you want to address. In case in point, at the Denver Art Museum, there was a large portion of our oceanic collection came from one particular donor's family. And in the process of reviewing what is most appropriate, we reached out to the donor's family, who were still major contributors to the institution, and we included them in the process of doing the assessments, looking at the pieces, and talking about what is the most appropriate pieces to keep in the collection, and what may not be the best for remaining in the collection. Additionally, we don't have staff resources that have great specialty in African art. So we consulted with other curators of African art, scholars in the field, and a variety of others who came in and helped us really. The primary thing that we were doing there was we were looking for fakes and forgeries, and we identified a few of them and removed them from our collection because they were not appropriate to remain in the collection. With NAGPRA Nazi-era deaccessioning, it's important to note that in order to repatriate, you have to deaccession first. So as Julie mentioned, not everyone truly understands a lot of the intricacies or the nuances to deaccessioning, but it is a process that institutions need to do in order to get to other processes as well. But what's, well, when it comes to, I can't speak as much about the Nazi era, but definitely with the NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, this really does come down to kind of a legal title issue, because you can't sell or you can't give away something that you don't own. And in order to, in the deaccessioning process, I contacted the National NAGPRA office to get some advisement on how to actually proceed with this. What are we legally required to do? What are we ethically required to do? And those are obviously sometimes two different things here. But what I was advised by the legal counsel of the National NAGPRA office is that we need, as an additional step in the review of, if there's any donor restrictions or if we actually own legal title, is to look and see if tribal consultation was done on the particular objects that we want to we're proposing for deaccession. And as far as they're concerned, if objects have been included in the summaries or the inventories that were made as part of the NAGPRA process, that is considered notification. And there are, from the National NAGPRA office, no other required steps that you must take. Now, what we did is, when we came up with a list of pieces we were proposing for deaccessions, and then we went back to the individual files, looked at all of our consultation records, all of our notifications that we sent to tribes, and we used as it was a separate kind of like checkbox. Did we actually do this? Because if we didn't, an additional step would have been required, and we would have had to reach back out to tribes in those areas in order to confirm that that is done. Because really what it comes down to with NAGPRA is that you, as a curator, are not the person who gets to decide whether something fits NAGPRA or not. It's up to the tribe, so notification must be made, so that way tribes have an opportunity to express an interest in an object. In those particular instances, I would highly recommend that you just outright take them off of your list for deaccessioning, and then have your conversations outside of this process. Also, other things that we do is we, donors, heirs, living artists, and other appropriate interested parties should be notified with a letter of intent to deaccession in advance. You're not necessarily looking for permission. You do, if you've done the legal title check and you confirm that you do actually own the piece, then you're not legally obligated to do this, but it is a professional courtesy. I mean, from an ethical standpoint, you should be entering into a discussion with the families of someone who maybe donated something, or that's at least what we do here. It's also the DAM's policy that if a permanent collection artwork is considered for deaccession and is estimated by the curator to have a value that exceeds $10,000, we require 2 outside independent appraisals to be done in writing and presented along with the proposed deaccessioning to our internal committees that review this kind of material. But also, the idea of presenting to other committees is also important, because there has to be some level of checks and balances. Curators should not be kind of go off on their own and make all these decisions like completely outside of anyone else's oversight. The director, if you have a collections committee, and certainly a board of trustees, should approve all deaccessions and should be presented as such. Perhaps there's, other institutions have other criteria for how that's actually done, but that is what we do here. Also, it's important to note that our museum recognizes several potential means of removal, which we haven't yet discussed, but these can include public auctions, sale to private collections or dealers, exchange with other institutions, donations to other institutions, repatriation, or destruction. And of course, in accordance with AAMD policies, specifically for art museums, as Julie did mention, funds realized from artworks that are deaccessioned or removed shall be used for the acquisition of other artworks exclusively. And here at the Denver Art Museum, we also have the policy that artworks purchased with funds realized from the deaccessioning or removal of artworks from the permanent collection, or including apparatus or non-accession collections, will bear the credit to the donors of the original artwork when appropriate. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we have to go through as curators, at least here in our institution. And I'm happy to answer any of the questions if anyone has any now, or we can save it to the end.
Thank you, John. And I would continue to encourage you to ask questions, but I actually have a question for you, John. With a collection of 20,000 artworks, where does one start?
Well, one of the things that we're asked to do on a regular basis, so every like 5 years or so, is to do a collections assessment, which, as I mentioned, it identifies strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities. But the purpose of that is actually to create kind of a roadmap for what our individual collecting is going to look like moving forward. It lays out, like what kind of artists are we interested in? What genres of art are we interested in? It really helps us focus what we are doing. But in order to identify what you want to do, you have to actually see what you have already. So that can be, well, obviously, I guess the hope is that you have subject matter expertise or specialization within the area in which you are a curator. Now, and of course, there are going to be areas where you don't have specialization. I mean, in mine, just the American Indian collection alone, we have artworks by artists from over 200 different Native nations across Native North America. I certainly cannot have specialization in all of them by any means, or even close to that. So in those particular instances, I may send a report of what we do have in our collection to a colleague who has a specialization in that area, and maybe ask for their opinions on where they see some of our strengths, where they see some of our weaknesses, and then identify areas for opportunity for future collecting. So this is kind of an ongoing process that curators, it's a very useful process and helpful process in terms of moving forward. But the process helps you be more streamlined in what you are collecting, so that way in the future, perhaps we could, I'm not going to say avoid deaccessioning, because it is a necessary part of our job, but I think in the past there may have been times when entire collections were taken in without any kind of consideration for how they may be used, or maybe they were taken in because you didn't have anything like it at the time, and as I said, we've collected past it. So these are all things we just kind of have to keep in mind, and where to start. I mean, it's doing a collection review. Focus on a particular area, dive into that particular area, and build upon that, and then go into the next area. 20,000 objects is a lot to deal with, but thankfully we had some great people collecting in the past, so we ultimately have a great collection that I would want to keep and preserve in its integrity as it is today.
Okay. Thank you, John. And thank you to all the people who start to ask questions, and we'll get to some of those at the end. We're going to move on to Lauren Silverson to discuss the registrar's role in the whole process. Lauren?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. And it's great to hear both Julie and John talk about their importance in this process. And what is my impetus is really about the nuts and bolts of it. As a registrar, you come to this whole thing as an assistant to or in service of the curatorial department, and what the curators hope and dream and want to make happen. With regard specifically to deaccessioning, it can be a long process. And that's my way of introduction to say that I've been at the Portland Museum of Art here in Maine since 2002. And I've seen a few rollovers, maybe 3, generally speaking, of curatorial staff here. And with every single one of these groups of curators, I've seen deaccessioning happen, and I've been facilitating it here. And every time it's different, and every time I guess what's most important to say is that there is some consistency, and that resides in what Julie talked about with the collections management policy and what John alluded to in terms of their actual process of deaccessioning. But the objects, the outcome, and the pitfalls along the way have been just amazingly varied and different with every single time we've done it. And so I'm going to estimate that I've seen since 2002 probably a total of 6 deaccessioning moments, and they range in size from 2 or 3 objects to 200 or 300 objects. The reasons that we've deaccessioned here at the Portland Museum of Art have varied greatly too, probably with the default being our storage. We have 20,000 objects basically in our collection, and we do store them all still on site here at the museum. And I don't think that's going to last much longer, but we've renovated and we've moved storage rooms twice here. And so in that process, we have been able to make assessment about our collections, but also understand how we can utilize the resources, the space, and the staff that we have here. So if storage is our number 1 reason for moving forward with deaccessioning, I think our number 2 reason moving forward is, believe it or not, lack of relevance to the collection. And under that, there's also a really tiny little subcategory of, is it art? Believe it or not, this museum has been up and running since 1888, and there have been a number of objects accessioned that really truly don't fit that definition of art. And the only time that actually gets called out is when a curator picks up a rock and says, why is this here? And when there can be, some reasons. Certainly it was it was out at Winslow Homer's studio, and it made it back to the PMA, and we accessioned it. So you have to, be open and willing to watch curators in their process, at the same time understand that nobody's perfect and nobody's doing it exactly right in terms of building a collection or kind of changing a collection. And we can't underestimate the time. That's the other thing that deaccessioning has moved deaccessioning projects here forward, is whether we can manage the time resource around it. It's surprisingly long. It's very difficult. I mean, there's a lot of work involved. But what also comes back to haunt me time and time again is that things that we deaccessioned and literally left the building like 2 and 3 years ago, the registrar's department is still managing out there. And that's, it's kind of the same thing with traveling exhibitions. Once out of the building, everybody forgets about them, but the registrar's office still is managing them. So I would never underestimate how long a deaccessioning process is going to take. It always is a bit longer than you think. You say, oh yeah, this summer we'll do all our deaccessioning. It will start this summer, but it may not end until next summer or the summer after that. So the other kind of advice that I like to give people is to have a plan B. Because even though you've thought through your process, you've gotten your expertise, you've gotten your information from people, and you're moving through it in a very streamlined way, things happen that you don't always expect. For instance, we have deaccession paintings with the very obvious reason to sell, and they haven't sold. So now we have objects that aren't in our collection, but they have no market value. And now what do we do with them? And everybody planned, hoped, we were told that yes, indeed, they did have a market value. But lo and behold, when they went on the auction block, they didn't sell. So when I say we need a plan B, meaning, so literally, if they didn't sell at the auction block, what is the next tier, or what is the next step to actually physically removing them from our building? So that's why I think that a deaccessioning program is incredibly healthy and wonderful to engage in. It's a very tight, close relationship that develops between people when they're involved in such a process. And you have to have the tools in place that Julie named and John named. But you have to expect the unexpected, honestly, because anything can happen, and it's not always as straightforward as you hope it is. So I'm welcome to take questions, and I'm sure people have ideas about what do we do if something like that happens. So I'll turn it back over to you, Denise.
Thank you, Lauren. And I would encourage people to continue asking questions. Thank you. They are actually coming in. I actually had a question for you, Lauren. John discussed some of the options of deaccessioning, selling it at auction, exchange, destruction. Have you seen any other methods to deaccession an art object?
Yeah. I've seen a couple of different ones. I mentioned the rock earlier that was actually accessioned in the jar collection that came from Winslow Homer's studio, which is out on Prout's Neck, which is right on the ocean. It's a really beautiful place. I hope that people come to Maine and get to see this. But we took the rock back. Okay. And, we moved all identifying marks on it, but the rock ended up back in the ocean. So another example of things that are in our collection that truly aren't art is we had a fair number of small ceramic figures that came into the collection in the early 1970s that were all mass-produced, similar to Hallmark figures. I don't know if people remember those things, but they're little ceramic animals. And it was a big collection, and they had no market value whatsoever. They were not art. And we had the option of disposing of them. And to me, that personally didn't feel right, because I thought, well, they do have some value to somebody. So what we ended up doing, and of course we went through the whole procedure to do this, was that myself and my assistant registrar, we walked them over to the local Goodwill store here and donated them because we felt that was the most transparent and obviously the most easily done things. And that I didn't want to spend the afternoon, frankly, trashing all these things, which was seemingly the only alternative.
Thank you, Lauren. And thank you to everyone that's been asking questions. And so next we're going to turn to Nina Del Rio from Sotheby's. What's the auction house's role in the whole process? Nina?
Well, thank you. This is actually so interesting, listening to my colleagues in different parts of the field talk about deaccessioning. And I just want to step back a little bit and touch on something that John brought up, which is deaccessioning is part of a larger strategy for an institution's collection, which is an important, we believe, an important way of thinking, what is the long-term plan, the mission, the collecting goals for an institution? And often when a museum is thinking about a deaccession, first they will have tried to really focus on where is the collection going, what are the strengths, what are the areas of focus, what are the areas that the collection is not going to be about. And often the end product of that conversation is understanding, how do we refine this collection and what should it not be about? And thus deaccessioning is part of the conversation. I would say from our perspective, or at the point in the process, and I'll talk a little bit about when we would get involved, a museum would really be thinking about, here are some objects that we're considering for deaccession. And museums as sellers are they have very unique needs. You need somebody on the ground at an auction house, in a dealer, in an arts organization that understands your needs and understands how we can carefully, thoroughly sort of strategize on a correct way to deaccession. So if there's one sort of point that I would want to hone in on for any curator and for any trustee or director of a museum, is that we can be a resource to museums. We pride ourselves on having a great depth and breadth of experience in different museum deaccessions, and certainly keep ourselves abreast of all best practices, and want to be, again, the resource that can help you through this process. And you are the stewards of where the collection is going, and you will decide when it's appropriate to bring an auction house in. But we can be talking to you and thinking with you at the beginning of the process about works to consider for deaccession, in the middle when maybe you've identified a group but you haven't quite honed in on exactly what you're going to sell. Think about, and of course, value is not, I really want to stress this point, value is not the driving objective here, but we can help everyone, curators, to understand what is the market value, where might there be market opportunities that could help you make decisions, at least about what might you think about deaccessioning or selling first, rather than maybe in a few years when the market picks up. So give market advice. And we can also, and I think this is a point that we'd like everyone to know, museums have curatorial expertise in the areas where they have focused and where they will focus in the future. And the auction houses, I think all of the major auction houses, and there's so many great ones, can come in and provide expertise in areas where you don't have curatorial representation. And so we can help to also augment. We can be another set of eyes. We can be doing research that you might not be doing in-house. And again, sort of underscoring that we can be a resource to institutions. So often we see sort of two very different types of deaccessions, and I thought it might be useful to talk about this. One is, and really the focus of this conversation, one is about collection refinement, and just as I'm referring to, as an organization thinks about the direction of a collection, and what does each department represent, and how do they fit into the whole of what the mission of the institution is, there is collection refinement, call it around the edges, and I'm using my hands, but of course you can't see them. What I really mean is, where are works not being used by the collection? Are they not, is frankly the quality not up to the standards of the museum? Is the condition of the object not in keeping, is it really not something that you would show on exhibition, or is the object itself just not in keeping with the collecting mission of the organization? There we see museums really sort of looking to their collection and understanding, what would we never show, and how do we refine the collection? And yes, the byproduct of that is funds for acquisitions, which could help us as an organization buy something that frankly will improve the collection. So selling what you would not have in the collection for one reason, to buy something that you would have in the collection, is a very sort of what we see as a productive and normal and healthy way that collections can evolve. Another type of deaccessioning that we see is call it sort of a purposeful or strategic. Maybe a museum has identified an acquisition and they might look to parts of their collection, again, where they could deaccession something where maybe they have depth within an artist or an area, and the object that they would think about deaccessioning is not, again, up to the same standards as what they might show, and not as high quality as what they might buy. So those are really, and I won't get into the details now, but they're very different exercises. I will say both require a very thorough process and a very thoughtful process. And having, my team, our team, the group at Sotheby's that thinks about museums and museum needs, we've been doing this a long time. My gosh, I've been here doing this for a long time. And if we've seen anything, we've seen different types of deaccessions, and we tend to be able to help museums to understand, how do other museums do this productively? What does a positive deaccession look like? What are some of the what are some of the signposts that would tell you that maybe a deaccession was going in a direction that would not be positive for the institution? And in fact, what we really pride ourselves on is creating a team around a museum project, around a museum deaccession, that brings different disciplines to bear to help an organization think through some of these issues. And so not only, of course, do we bring specialization around the objects, and our hope is that, again, we are we are additive. We're helping to augment your curatorial expertise and really fill in gaps where you may not have expertise, having that conversation. In addition, a team on the ground that really thinks about museums and directions that museums are heading in this country and in the world. In addition, a strong communications team who will help to, okay, you are a public institution. You need to think through, how are you going to publicly communicate what you're doing? And really bringing these disciplines to bear alongside an institution as they embark on a project like this. Some deaccessions are incredibly straightforward. The choice of objects is quite obvious. A museum would say, well, we would never have these. Let's think about strategies to dispose of them. And those are the easier ones to think through, though, of course, again, the process needs to be thorough and thoughtful. And we can think through some ways of selling. And I think we touched on already, there's public auction, which, of course, many institutions choose to sell at public auction because not only can you demonstrate that you're sort of fulfilling a fiduciary duty by publicly opening an object up to competition, but also the process is incredibly transparent. But there are other options such as private sale. And when an object really occupies a very particular sort of place in collecting, when there are really a limited number of buyers and an object needs introduction, private sale could be an option. But as I was alluding to, there are other types of deaccessions which are sometimes not as straightforward. The other types of deaccessions that are just more publicly noteworthy, that will catch attention of journalists. And not every deaccession is like this, but we believe strongly that thinking through all of these different issues in advance and erring on the side of incredible thoroughness to try to anticipate all angles is one of the ways to create a productive and positive deaccession, one where you can really anticipate and starting, as I said in the beginning, on what is the strategy for the collection, understanding very clearly, why am I selling this object, gaining consensus among your very important constituents, including your trustees, as John alluded to, the directors, you as a curator stewarding this process, and then understanding how is it going to be received by my constituents outside of the institution. These are really the sort of goalposts that we at Sotheby's would think through as we partner with different museums through this process. And I think the only sort of last point I'll leave on this is that you have resources. You have resources in auction houses, you have resources in specialists out there, you have resources in dealers, people who have experience in the market. And it's sometimes productive to bring those resources to bear kind of at the start of the process as one of the ways to gather information as you're making your very important decisions. So we sometimes encourage museums just to bring us in early. We would never make your decisions for you, but we can be additive to the type of information that you would consider as you're looking at a deaccession in what we would think is a holistic, how does this fit into sort of the strategy of the institution, the sort of the strategic plan in general is how we would look at it.
Thank you so much, Nina. And I would still encourage you to ask questions along the side panel. My question to you, Nina, would be, especially at a larger museum, such as the Denver Art Museum, how do you go about the process of processing so many artworks to like evaluate which ones would be most beneficial to the museum and would probably sell at auction?
It's a good question and a good example, and John will remember because we worked with the Denver Art Museum. I think in a very mechanical way, first and foremost, again, as a resource to the museum, we are bringing a team of specialists in, to specialists based on what are the objects that the museum is even considering? So they may or may not have made their decisions about exactly what they want to sell, but primarily they would know what collecting areas do these objects represent in this group that I'm considering. And we as an auction house will bring a specialist in to consider each and every collecting area. And there are times when we will bring in consultants because we don't even have that specialization in-house, but it is our responsibility to give you the best market information that we can, and at the same time talk to you about the quality of the object and some of your decisions. So we come in and really undertake this very thorough process. And even in the case of the Denver Art Museum sale, we partnered with another auction house very productively so that we could take care of the entire deaccession, which was many hundreds of objects for the Denver Art Museum. But we want to bring that same sort of thoroughness in collecting areas and thoughtfulness in the process so that we do become a resource for the museum. But it's a team. It takes a small village. It took some time, and it's, at the end of the day, it's a lot of fun. So get to spend time with curators like John and his colleagues.
Thank you, Nina. I am going to start asking some questions. Unless any of the panelists have questions for each other, I was going to start to ask questions from the audience. So does anyone? Go ahead, Julie.
I just want to underscore a couple things that Nina said. I think that kind of tie back to some of the professional practices about the collections refinement, and John mentioned this too. Critical need to not only have your collections management policy, which has all the criteria that you're going to use in the process, but a collecting plan. And that's your sort of strategic plan for your collections. And I think that's a really important document that I would encourage all institutions to have. And the other thing that came up a number of times is transparency. And I think that is just so important, this sort of thoughtful process and being transparent, and especially thinking about all your audiences and your stakeholders, because you're explaining this process and doing that make perfect sense to your fellow curators and other museum professionals. Some things will just happen, it's just normal business. You're deaccessioning something, you do it as it's no big deal. But then there's that one situation again where the journalist gets a hold of it, or it's a very high profile object, or something with a lot of dollars attached to it, or something for many reasons. And what the public sees as this, they don't understand and see all the intricacies of the process and what goes into it and the thought. They're just seeing the outcome of this is leaving the collection or leaving the museum, or the whole rationale for it. So I think having your backup and your best defense is to have the policies, the procedures, and everything documented about how and why you did this. And it was a thorough and thoughtful process. And then you can also explain that that falls within the standards and best practices and the ethics of not only the museum field, but the discipline of your institution. So you have, that's kind of your leg to stand on, because like I said, the general public often is not understanding the nuances of this, and they also don't understand that this happens. This is happening all the time. They see periodically maybe high profile cases. So I just want to underscore those two things.
Thank you, Julie. Anyone else? Okay, so I'm actually going to ask you the first question, Julie. Someone wants to know to what extent is deaccessioning in order to gain financial resources a valid criteria?
Well, from the perspective of the American Association of Alliance of Museums, it is not a valid criteria. If that is the case, if you are having financial distress, like there's other issues to look at. I mean, that should not be your first line of defense. Of like you have to go back and figure out, well, why are we in this situation? And if it's just a band-aid to try to generate income, that is not going to serve the long-term sustainability of the institution, and therefore putting all the collections at risk. Okay,
thank you. I'm going to ask a question, I guess, that can go to, I think it's targeted towards John, but I think this is a question that other people can weigh in on. Beyond the nuts and bolts of deaccessioning, how could deaccessioning serve to be good press for the institution, i.e. NAGPRA and building relationships with the tribes, or deaccessioning to refine collection and meet new goals, i.e. diversifying collections?
Well, I'll start off by saying, well, hi, Mindy, because I saw she's want to ask the question. You know, the good press, bad press, I mean, it should never really be your guiding force for what you choose to proceed with. Although perhaps if you know you're going to get really bad press, you might second guess whether you're actually going to deaccession something, or at least go through it in a very, very, very considerate way. But when it comes to NAGPRA specifically, if you're deaccessioning something that with the intention of repatriation, that discussion needs to happen with the tribes and you know, have a consultation. I can tell you one particular instance of a museum that I know that pushed a repatriation on a tribe that didn't really want the material, and then put out a big press release about doing it. So the tribe didn't really want the material back. They didn't really want this advertised, but the museum went ahead and did it. That is problematic in a variety of different ways. Some of the material that you may be deaccessioning and then repatriating is a particular sensitivity, where a tribe or, you know, groups within the tribe may not want it known that those particular objects even had left the community. So so the best advice is actually follow the leadership of the tribes when it comes to that kind of opportunities to either share the information or not share the information about a potential repatriation through, and of course the accessioning. There are certainly, you know, positive, you know, opportunities. We had some Navajo sand paintings in our collection that the subject matter was of particular religious sensitivity. The objects themselves were not subject to NAGPRA because they didn't fit one of the actual categories of NAGPRA. However, we knew we would never show them. We would never want to, like, you know, disrespect or offend anyone for showing them. And we knew that having them back in the community was the most appropriate way. So we deaccessioned them with the intention of donating them to the Navajo Nation Museum, where they are now. Because then it's up to them and their own community to decide when it is appropriate or if it's ever appropriate to show them. But we knew we would never do that. But again, I mean, I'm sharing the information now, but we didn't put out a press release for it. You know, it is about building those relationships, because we do have an existing relationship with the Navajo Nation Museum, and, you know, other projects may come up in the future that maybe this is, you know, helped along the process, you know, showed some goodwill. So there, you know, press should not be the motivation, but relationship building can be certainly part of the conversation. Another quick example is a museum here in Denver just relocated directly across the street from our administration building as a to celebrate them moving into the neighborhood. And as part of our ongoing collection refinement anyway, we found some Colorado-based artists that we were not using, we were not showing, we're not necessarily the most appropriate for our collection, but that is a focus of that institution. So as a kind of a welcome to the neighborhood gift, we gifted them to that other institution where they will be shown, they will be seen, and the Colorado artists that are now in their collection will be celebrated. So it was really kind of a win-win for everyone in that instance.
Thank you, John. I think this question could go to both John and Lauren, and of course, Nina and Julie can weigh in. How do you manage the cost investment of deaccessioning, both time and financial, such as outside appraisals?
Lauren, please go ahead.
I'll jump in and say that the time you can't really put a dollar amount to. It's a resource that the museum has to be able to back on its own completely. The outside appraisals, we have found that most auction houses will give us free appraisals or free advice or free expertise. We haven't actually ever had to pay for an appraisal or evaluation of object that we're intending to deaccession. John, how about you guys?
I'll be honest, that's kind of an enigma to me exactly where, like, where the funds come from to do some of those the appraisals that are needed. I know other, like some curators here, they have donors that will actually donate financial resources to them, or they may have department funds that are specifically for that purpose. I don't. But we also, in the deaccessioning process, out of all the pieces that we deaccession, there were very, very few that exceeded by my estimate to be over that $10,000 threshold that we self-impose on us. So that wasn't necessarily necessary, but also as part of the whole deaccessioning process, we had I don't even know how many, but let's just say 5 auction houses come in and assess the collection, and as part of their bid for it. But in doing so, they kind of had to assign some numbers. So we were able to kind of have a little bit of reassurance in that way as well by the process of the whole institution going through the process of deaccessioning and collection refinement.
Okay, great. I'm still looking at a couple of questions. I think this one will be going to Nina. I think I have 2 for you. What is the typical financial relationship between a deaccessioning museum and an auction house brought in to assist? Is there a contract based on a scope of work, or what kind of relationship do you have with the museum? If you can answer that question.
Yes, no, of course. I mean, every relationship, especially financially, and really the whole strategy is a partnership. So every relationship is different, and we will craft, and it's very bespoke, financial structures that meet the needs of the institution and also foster the partnership. So it's very much on a case-by-case basis. There's not really a standard, though I will say we're very aware of working with nonprofits. And so I think our financial structures sort of honor and recognize that. But again, it's a partnership that brings resources to bear and thinks about sort of the before, the during, and the after, especially as I think Lauren said, there are times when works don't sell. And so if anyone is working with an auction house, the auction house should be thinking through all of those steps of the process with you and for you, and be creating options and solutions along the way. And the financial structure it should feed into that.
Perfect. I have another question. What if the artwork doesn't have a market value, an unknown artist or local or obscure artist to sell at auction? How would you go about evaluating that?
So, and this is often part of the process of evaluating a large group. Of course, there might be works or artists that don't have what we call a secondary market value. And that would mean that past an initial sale, they hadn't been retraded publicly at auction. And so there's really no public record to go back and look at. And then when you do a little bit more digging, there might not even be sort of searchable primary sale records. And so you might think, this artist doesn't really have a market, this object doesn't have a market, it's a rock or whatever object you're talking about. And then in those cases, the auction houses are advising the museum, sharing the research, and in all cases, and this is a reminder for every institution, auction houses will do in-depth research, and that research is something that they're very happy to share with you, and at the higher values becomes very important in justifying value, and in the cases when something doesn't have a market value also becomes important, and then we all think through, or the institution thinks through, what are the other options? And I think someone else talked about donation, and donation for parts of collections that really don't have a market value can be a wonderful way of augmenting a collection that frankly has a different scope and mission than your own.
Thank you, Nina. I think this is a general question. It's kind of long, so our collections include fine art, archives, and historical objects. The highest priority for us is to deaccession historical objects that are taking up much of our limited storage. Many of these objects have no donor records. Is it best to establish the museum's ownership by default, having been the repository on a long-term status since the 1980s, or can deaccessioning be less formal, having no paper trail associated so far?
That's a tough one. Really, if you can establish or you can document that the work that you've done to try and establish a legal title transfer or proof of ownership, anything that can show that you have done everything you can to figure out who the donor was, then I think you can go ahead and proceed with the deaccessioning process. 1980 really wasn't that long ago, so there should be people still living who donated it, or next generation of people that could help you with that. So just any kind of thread or piece of thread that you can pick up and you can go down and try and find out and be able to document that you have done your best work to try and find legal ownership transfer to the institution, then I'd say that it's probably okay to proceed with the full backing of your board or other governing body.
Okay. Thank you. 2 more questions, and this might be in your category, Lauren. If you deaccession fakes, what is the disposal approach to it?
I can only speak from an art museum perspective, not any kind of archaeological or historic objects, but in the art museum world, I think it would be common practice, and we would certainly follow it here, is that we would destroy.
Mm-hmm. And someone asked, can you expand on giving examples of destruction, how you would go about the process of destroying?
Sledgehammer. The sledgehammer is what I said.
Yeah, no, we physically, if it's a painting, we remove it from its stretcher bar and we cut it with scissors. And same with photographs and works on paper in general, is that, and then we dispose of that. What I like to do, which maybe sounds kind of silly, but it makes me sleep at night, is that I take the remains, the pieces of canvas or the pieces of paper, and I give a handful to each person in my department, and I say, take this home and put it in your trash. So it doesn't go out in the PMA trash, it goes out in people's homes, which are, far apart and in between.
Okay. And I have one for you, John. Do funds from your deaccession objects have to go back to your collection area, or can they be used for another collecting area?
Here at the Denver Art Museum, they stay within the departments, and then as a department, we've determined that it's most appropriate that if it's an American Indian object, that's the accession, the funds go to for just American Indian objects. If it's African, just for African collection. If it's Oceanic, just for the Oceanic collection. We don't go down to, if it was a Lakota object, that it has to be a Lakota piece that we acquire in the future. We're not going to that level, but we are keeping them even within the collections within the department. So that way, if I don't get any pressure to say, oh, go deaccession a bunch of things from your collection because our modern and contemporary department wants to buy an expensive painting. That doesn't happen. We have kind of our own little buckets, I guess you could say. We don't have an acquisition budget, so all of the funds that we have available to us for acquiring new works through purchase either come through deaccessioning or through financial donations for that particular purpose. So it really is within the departments.
Okay, thank you. And Lauren, did you want to speak to your institution?
We're very similar. Maybe not. We're much smaller. We only have 3 curators here, so it's definitely a group decision. And we don't always stay with. If we deaccession a European work, the proceeds don't necessarily stay with the European curator. There's a little bit more of interplay, but the intention and the idea behind the donor and the credit line is exactly the same way. We keep track of the original gift and recognize that donor in the credit line with any new acquisition we make with those funds.
Thank you. I think this is it could be a general question. Has anyone experienced a case where the donor or the family of the donor objected to the deaccessioning? If yes, how is that handled?
John?
We recently deaccessioned over 800 works from our collection, and we didn't have any issues. So, and that's over, oh, I mean, I don't even, Janine, you may even remember because you helped with the process, but I mean, it was like 150, 200 different donors or more, and we had no issues whatsoever.
And I remember the majority of the donors were notified, so they received letters about the deaccessioning process. So, yeah.
I've seen it happen. And the museum immediately, I mean, I've seen it happen in the middle of not necessarily a sale process, but the sort of points just before the sale were well underway, shipping, and this was a very high profile object, and the museum immediately retracted it, and we as the auction house, you know, of course, honored that and shipped it back and sort of stopped everything because the donor didn't agree and found out a little bit late in the process.
Mm-hmm. There was a really good question that was do you have any, it's like, I guess a general panel question. Do you have any aspirations or advice for future generations of art leaders? How can they learn from your shortcomings and triumphs? What do you wish you knew earlier in your career about collection practices and I guess deaccessioning? I guess, what is your inspirational work? Like what, you know?
Are we specifically talking about like in relation to deaccessioning or just like?
I think since it's demystifying deaccessioning, yes, what could you, what words of wisdom can you all give about the whole process?
I mean, the one thing I will just add is kind of reinforcing the importance, even as Julie said, of having a collecting plan. That is something that perhaps did not exist in the past, in the past many decades in the museum, but is common practice now. So with the understanding that we are being very strategic in the acquisitions that we make. So I will say, I certainly have shortcomings, but I can't necessarily say that they fall into this particular category, but I can learn from past experiences that, we have been, we as contemporary curators who are working, in today's time have been saddled with the baggage of the past, which you can actually lead into a lot of other areas of discussion, such as like, we make it a policy of not taking gifts with any restrictions, because going through the deaccessioning process now and reviewing all the records, we're finding old restrictions that were put on things that, a curator in the past took into an institution thinking that, maybe not even like considering like what's going to happen in the future. But here we are many decades later in a situation where, maybe a particular object has disintegrated and we need to deaccession it because it's like literally just like a pile of powder at this point, and really not appropriate to the museum anymore. But we have donor restrictions to say we can't do that. So I think it's kind of a little bit of red flag or a caution for today to be very, very strategic in what you're acquiring and be very mindful that any commitments that you make today are going to have long-lasting implications.
Mm-hmm. Did anyone else want to talk about what they wish they had known about deaccessioning?
I would just add that communicating your deaccession both internally and externally, and I talked a little bit about communicating to the public, and one of my colleagues who's actually sitting next to me just passed me a note to remind me, the way that organizations, museums communicate their decision to deaccession and the choices for deaccessioning and why internally within the organization we've seen is a sort of critical process and can be a real make or break between a positive, productive deaccession and one that is potentially misunderstood, and misunderstanding within the organization is not productive and can be dangerous. So we always encourage our museum partners to think through their internal communication plan, to have a consistent message, and to make sure the constituents who need to know understand, and that sort of cascades out throughout the organization as you get closer to your announcement.
Okay, thank you. So we have about 1 minute left, and I wanted to use the time to thank our panelists for taking part in the discussion, and thank the AAMC for sponsoring the webinar, and to remind you to join us for future conversations about deaccessioning. There are a lot of questions. They finally start to come in along the side, and some of the questions involve what happens when you deaccession works by living artists, and that will be a part of our future conversations when it comes to deaccessioning. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, especially our panelists, and I hope to see you for future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.